For me, the Stranger Things One Last Adventure documentary made season 5 and the Duffer brothers look a whole lot worse. I've spent the last week shocked that they even released it, that the Duffers even approved of it being released, because I am of the opinion it really does make them look that bad. But today I want to focus specifically on one aspect of the documentary that really stood out to me, that really upset me, largely because of how it relates to one of the many issues I did have with the finale, that being the final battle against the Mind Flayer. And because of how what they originally did right for that final battle made a lot more sense for Will's character arc, for what was previously established between Will and the Mind Flayer, and for the story of season 5 as a whole. In case you have no idea what I'm talking about, in the documentary we got a glimpse at one of the Duffers' laptops, and we got to see exactly what was on the screen. And on that screen we got to see a very different version of the ending of the final battle against the Mind Flayer. One where Will would have faced off against the Mind Flayer in the very end. The Mind Flayer would have roared at him and started to charge him, but Will, no longer afraid, would have taken the Mind Flayer apart from the inside out. The Mind Flayer would have then slammed to the ground in front of Will, and Will would have fallen to the ground along with it, because he was still connected to the hive mind, so the damage dealt to the Mind Flayer was also dealt to him. But ultimately, Will would have narrowly escaped death. This, in my opinion, is so much better than what we got, than how the Mind Flayer was ultimately taken down. But I still think it has room for improvement. And as such, it inspired me to think more about this idea as a framework and write my own version of the final battle. Now, I'm not going to get into every single scene I would have put in my rewrite for the final battle, because I am going to be working on a long video essay that is a full rewrite of Volume 2 and of the finale. But I do want to touch on some key points that I would have included that the Duffers did not include in this outline for the final battle that was revealed in the documentary. And in case you couldn't tell, much like with the last video, I don't have a script for this, so this is very much going to be a yapping style video. When it comes to the 3 video essay projects I'm working on, those will be a little more tightly scripted. Those 3 video essays being the following: a video diving deep into all of the plot holes, inconsistencies, plot contrivances, unanswered questions, and disregarded plot points, as well as how I would have addressed each of those things. A video discussing everything related to Byler, and the aforementioned Volume 2 and finale rewrite video. That being said, I'm going to get into my ideas for the final battle with the Mind Flayer now, so hear me out, bro chachos. So first, a few things to lay the groundwork. As I'm sure many of us Stranger Things fans will remember, all the way back in season 2, Will did face off against the Mind Flayer in episode 4. This happened after multiple episodes of Will being haunted by the Mind Flayer and his trauma with the Upside Down, which led Bob Newby to encourage Will to face his fears, face the Mind Flayer, unknowingly setting Will up for a season of even more trauma. Because, as we all remember, that confrontation with the Mind Flayer did not go as Bob Newby had anticipated, and certainly did not go as I'm sure young Will Byers hoped. We all know where the season goes from there. It all culminates in them trying to remove the Mind Flayer particles from Will before 11 shuts the gate to the Upside Down. Because, as the finale we did get chose to ignore, Will would die if the particles were not removed from him, if his connection to the Mind Flayer was not removed before 11 shut the gate. Now, Joyce and Jonathan ultimately succeeded in removing the particles from Will, but his connection to the Mind Flayer and the hive mind was never truly completely severed, which is something that we see throughout the rest of the show, barring his time in California, in which he does not feel his connection to the Mind Flayer. Keep all of that in mind, because I will get back to it later. Now, fast forward to the first 5 minutes of Stranger Things Season 5, where we get a closer glimpse into what actually happened to Will during his time in the Upside Down after being taken by the Demogorgon in Season 1. We see that Vecna intentionally took Will and seemed to inject Will with Mind Flayer particles all the way back in Season 1 before his confrontation with the Mind Flayer in Season 2. Something else I want to note at this point is the importance of that moment coming full circle in the finale of Season 5. Because if you'll remember, in Season 4, we also started with a flashback to Eleven's time in Hawkins' lab, the massacre at Hawkins' lab. A sequence that was not only paid off in episode 7 of Season 4, but was also paid off in the finale of Season 4 when Eleven faced off against Vecna once again. I think that storytelling framework worked very well in Season 4, and it should have been applied in Season Season 5. In Season 5, after we get to see the first 5 minutes and what happened to Will during Season 1, we do get Will's self-acceptance arc coming full circle in Episode 4, Sorcerer, which is when Will, upon accepting himself for who he truly is, gains powers and harnesses his connection to the hive mind to save his friends. But after that point, it feels like the first 5 minutes are for the most part disregarded or are no longer important to the plot. Yes, we do get one more conversation between Vecna and Will, where Vecna reveals that Will was his spy, his builder, and that Will is going to spy for him one last time. But that doesn't really amount to much because we only see that applied with Vecna using Will to locate Max's physical body in the hospital so that he can send the Demodogs after her. After that, it doesn't really amount to anything. We do get Will's coming out scene, which does imply that his connection to Vecna, the Mind Flayer, and the hive mind is going to be important in the final battle, and that's why he has to face his fears in Episode 7. But we never really see all of that. Everything I've talked about so far from Season 2 onward come to fruition in the final battle when Will is faced with the Mind Flayer, and I think that is a missed opportunity. So I think the beginning of the final battle could have played out in a very similar way to what we actually saw in the finale. Will feels and sees what Henry feels and sees as he is remembering his memory from the cave where the Mind Flayer first took a hold of him. The Mind Flayer's physical form awakens and begins attacking the party. 11 shows up and goes to have her fight with Vecna inside of the Mind Flayer. I'm keeping that basic framework the same. But aside from that, things are going to play out very differently. So when the party begins to engage the Mind Flayer, things are not going to go nearly as easily as they did in the finale that we actually got. The party is going to be narrowly escaping death at every turn. And Will is not going to be so far removed from the battle. He won't be in as close of proximity as the rest of the characters will be, but he's going to be visible and nearby. Now, as the party struggles in this confrontation, 11 is going to struggle as well because I do think her fight against Vecna was far too easy. Vecna leveled up his power in Season 5, and I don't think the fact that 11 did training sessions in the 18 months between Season 4 and 5 should make it so that she can face off against Vecna with relative ease. In terms of difficulty level for her, I'm imagining something similar to what we got at the end of Revenge of the Sith between Obi-Wan and Anakin, where the two characters are very evenly matched, or in less of a 1v1 fight comparison example, because Lord of the Rings is currently in theaters and I just got to see the extended edition of Two Towers for the first time in the theater. Think the Battle of Helm's Deep, where in some moments it seems as though the elves and the Rohirrim have the upper hand, only for the Uruk-hai to seem like they have the upper hand moments later. It's a push and pull framework that makes the stakes feel very high throughout the entire confrontation. So we have the party struggling, narrowly escaping death, and 11 struggling as well. And we have Will Byers facing what seemed to be the last of his fears in Episode 7 with his coming out scene. Watching the Mind Flayer, the entity that represents so much of his trauma and pain throughout the story of Stranger Things, nearly take the lives of those who are closest to him. This is where I think things could heat up a little bit, because I think we could reach a point in the battle where the Mind Flayer is about to take the life of Mike Wheeler, paralleling when the Demogorgon was about to get Mike in Episode 4, Sorcerer. It's in this moment that I believe Will could enter the fray, pulling the Mind Flayer's attention away from Mike and shifting it onto him. Now, much like with what the Duffers had written in this version of the script that was revealed in the documentary, I think we can still see the Mind Flayer roar and begin to charge at Will. But to add a little bit of extra spice, I think much like with what we saw in Episode 4, Will could slowly shut his eyes and remember that confrontation with the Mind Flayer from Season 2. Now, somewhat of a very quick side note, I think it's very important that this 1v1 confrontation between Will and the Mind Flayer in this final battle is framed and shot the same way as the confrontation was in Season 2. Because as Will is remembering that final confrontation with the Mind Flayer, where ultimately the Mind Flayer won, I think it would be very interesting if we flash back and forth between the present day and those memories, creating a direct visual parallel between the two scenes. The Mind Flayer is charging at Will in present day as the Mind Flayer from Season 2 is doing that whole tornado thing where its particles hit the ground in front of him before it reaches him. But then I think we could see an altered version of the final part of the memory, where instead of being afraid and being taken over by the Mind Flayer's shadow form from Season 2 in that memory, young Will in that memory at the same time as Will in the present day could say to the Mind Flayer that he's no longer afraid, that it can no longer control him and his life. life. Then I think it would be very interesting if we see Will in the memory take down the shadow form of the Mind Flayer, as Will in the present day begins to rip apart the Mind Flayer's physical form in the abyss from the inside out until eventually taking it down in front of him, much like what the Duffers had written in this version of the script. And in doing so, offering Eleven a temporary reprieve from Vecna from within the Mind Flayer and saving Mike and the party. Again, this is unscripted, it's a loose idea, but here's why I think it works so much better than what we actually got in the final confrontation. One, it pays off Will's trauma with the Mind Flayer that was established in season 2 in that moment where the Mind Flayer attacked him and took control of him. Without something akin to what I'm proposing here happening, we never actually get to see that moment from season 2 pay off. 2, it makes Will's coming out scene in episode 7 actually matter and actually have some bearing on the final fight. Because to me, as it exists now, it feels relatively irrelevant to the final fight. Sure, he has the line about how he's no longer afraid when he stops Vecna's I am Groot attack on Eleven, but him facing his fears in the coming out scene really had no bearing on that aspect of the final fight because we saw him do the very same thing in episode 5 against Vecna, which happened before the coming out scene happened. At least with what I'm proposing, it would feel like Will no longer being afraid would actually mean something and have some bearing on the outcome of the final fight. 3, it would pay off the first 5 minutes of season 5, where we saw Will being infected by the Mind Flayer particles for the very first time, because that was a moment where Vecna and the Mind Flayer by extension were robbing Will of his autonomy, and in my version of the final fight, Will would be regaining that autonomy. And 4, the Duffer brothers themselves said that Will was supposed to be the main character of season 5, but with how the final confrontation and really the finale as a whole ultimately played out, he did not feel like a main character, he felt more like a side character. This would pay off Will being the main character of season 5 and alongside Eleven the main character of the show, all while still allowing Eleven to have a central role in the final battle against Vecna, because Eleven has never really been intrinsically tied to the Mind Flayer in the way that Will has, but Eleven has been intrinsically tied to Vecna. So much of Eleven's backstory and trauma is tied to her interactions with Henry Creel in Hawkins' lab, which of course was explored in season 4, but ultimately she didn't truly win against Vecna in season 4, so this could be her moment to face her trauma with Vecna and ultimately come out on top. All that being said, I don't even think the final battle should end there. This is something that I'll get more into in my long rewrite video essay, but I think there should be a final phase to this fight where the Mind Flayer's shadow form rises from its physical body that has been defeated, and the entire party, including Will, would have to figure out how to defeat the Mind Flayer's final form, the shadow form. Having an additional phase to the fight would make the stakes feel a lot higher, right? You'd have a scenario in which the characters just won what would seem to be an impossible fight, only to realize moments later that the fight is not yet over. Plus, outside of raising the stakes, this would give us the Mind Flayer's shadow form back, which I think is the coolest iteration of the Mind Flayer by far. I don't think it looked terrible, but I wasn't the biggest fan of the Mind Flayer turning out to be a tangible, massive Godzilla monster. I think the Lovecrafty and eldritch horror that is the shadow form of the Mind Flayer is so much more interesting and intriguing, and would ultimately be a much more complex villain for the party to overcome. And now that I'm thinking of it, it would also fill somewhat of what I consider to be a hole, that being where the Mind Flayer shadow particles went when they exited the children from within the Mind Flayer and just went off into the air, because the last time we saw that happen, the Mind Flayer was not eliminated. I mean, that happening is literally how we got the Meat Flayer Mind Flayer from season 3. Now, all that said, to give you guys a loose idea of what I'm thinking for my rewrite for how they would face off against the shadow form, I think they would ultimately come to the realization that they cannot defeat this form of the Mind Flayer, its shadow form, unless they also take out Will. And while the rest of the party would of course fight to find a different option, I believe Will would ultimately make that sacrifice, much like what Harry Potter did in Deathly Hallows. The Duffers have, after all, said there are a lot of parallels between Harry Potter, the character, and the character of Will Byers. But of course, we can't have Will actually die in this story for a lot of reasons, which I will discuss again in a later video. And thankfully, we have a relatively simple solution for that was already established at the end of season 4, that being Eleven's ability to restart someone's heart, thus bringing them back to life. We could see Eleven do the very same thing with Will. And to really maximize the parallels, because I believe Byler was intended to be endgame at some point, I do not believe the Duffers when they say they never had it in mind. We could have a speech from Mike that parallels his speech to Eleven, which was inspired by Will in season 4, where Mike begs and pleads for Will to come back. That, alongside Eleven using her powers to bring Will back to life like what we saw with Max in season 4, would be perfect. Or could be perfect, depending on how it would be written. And I'm not a writer, but I'm going to do my best to write that scene in a way that is as compelling as humanly possible. In any case, that is the framework for how I think the ending of the final battle with the Mind Flayer should have played out. I am very curious to hear all of your thoughts and your feedback. Maybe you had a different idea for how the final fight could have played out, and I would love to hear that too, because I do think there are several different options that could maximize everything that came before with Will's character and generally with the story of Stranger Things. And maybe I'll discuss other ideas in another video at some point, but for now, this is the idea that I'm sticking with. This is, of course, YouTube, so like this video if you liked it, leave a comment with your thoughts, and please, if you did like it, hit the share button because that does help a lot. And I will see you guys in the next video, which may very well be that 1+ hour video essay about all of the plot holes, inconsistencies, so on and so forth.